All right, guys, it's time to get this transmission back together. Before we do that, we're gonna have to do a couple steps first. That involves knocking some of the old bearings out, and I'm gonna go ahead and replace the two countershaft bearings because I have new ones. And I'm gonna show you how to do that before we start putting it back together. All right, first thing I should mention is that I just bought this stainless steel detent pin because I noticed when I took the transmission off the first time, you guys probably saw the plastic pin that was broken. And if you remember from watching the last video, when I tore this apart the first time, I replaced it at that time. So I wasn't about to put another plastic one in there. So I got this one from Amazon. It's from the company Boost Monkey, and they say it fits pretty much every manual transmission, like the ZFs and stuff like that for BMWs. It also says it fits E30, so I just went ahead and bought it, but the pin size on the back on the case is too small to accept this. So all you have to do is drill it out using a 25/64 inch drill bit, and it'll go right in. You can see some scratches there. I installed it with a socket on an extension with a hammer and just pounded it right in. So with this size drill bit, it's going to give you a nice interference fit, so this thing isn't going to slip out or anything. But yeah, I'll let you know how that is, but I figure it's better than the plastic one. So anyway, this is the first bearing that's going to come out during the reassembly process. We're going to knock this out from the other side. As you can hear, that's part of my noise, I'm sure. So this is a used bearing. I'm also going to take this snap ring off and replace this front countershaft bearing here in a second. But yeah, this is going to be the first one to come out and the last one to go back in. All right, so removal of the input shaft bearing is pretty easy. You just flip the front case over, and you're gonna grab something like a drift or a punch rather, I guess, and just lightly tap on the outside race of this bearing, or hard if you have to. Just be careful of the, don't mar up the bore or anything, but it should come right out. So I'm just gonna use this punch here. And that's all it took for mine. You might have to tap it a couple more times than that, or maybe not, but there's your bearing. Okay, next we're gonna get the front countershaft bearing shell. Grab your snap ring pliers, and so my snap ring's stuck in there because it's never been out, so I'm gonna help it along with a screwdriver here. I'm trying not to stretch it too much, but you might have to get it out. There you go. There's also going to be a little spacer in here. So don't forget the orientation of that. It goes in between the bearing shell and the snap ring. There's another spacer in there that I didn't see. Go ahead and take that out. And I believe this is going to get pushed into the case. Yes. So there you go. There's the countershaft bearing shell removed. This is the front countershaft bearing part number. I'm going to try to put these all the part numbers down in the description too, so you'll see them down there. So this is the piece that we just knocked out. You're going to see this little cutout here, and when we flip the transmission around, you're going to see where this lines up. It's for oiling. Here's the bearing itself. We're not going to be putting this in just yet. This looks okay. This is the old one, but I figured why not put a new one in since we have one. So if you see the cutout right here on the bore, that's where that cutout's going to match up to. So we're going to go ahead and drive this in here. Okay, before you install this bearing shell, I'm not entirely sure, but it doesn't look like there's a shoulder or a stop or anything for the bearing. So what I'm going to do, and if anybody knows better, let me know in the comments, but I'm going to put the circlip back in and then stack the shims on the back and then press the bearing in until it won't go any farther against this. I think that's the best plan of attack. All right, so what I'm gonna do to make this easier, I'm gonna use my heat gun and heat up the bore here so the bearing should slip in a lot easier during installation. All right, don't forget to line the oil cutout with the one on there, and go ahead and get it lined up. And I'm using a 27mm socket on an extension to get this thing pressed in here. Sounds like it's bottoming out against the shims, and it is. So that's what you should end up with. As long as you got it heated up pretty hot, you should go in easy with a hammer and a socket. All right, moving on to the rear of the case. This is your thrust washer for your output shaft. Yours might be stuck to the output shaft bearing, or it might still be on the output shaft. That's where it's going to go, right there. When you put it back together, just be mindful of that. We're not going to replace the output shaft bearing just yet, because I'm going to go ahead and replace this bearing shell for the rear countershaft bearing. And to do that, we're going to have to heat up the housing and use a slide hammer bearing puller with these type of collets here. There might be a different way, but this is the right tool to get the job done if you want to do it without a struggle. I got mine from Harbor Freight, but it wasn't that expensive, but you can get it pretty much at anywhere. Essentially what we're going to do is get this in here between this little cutout in the bearing shell, open it up until it grabs onto the bearing shell, get it opened up as much as you can. And I would put this in the vise because this thing's going to want to pull around on us, but I got the shaft in there right now and I don't have two vices. I'm going to go ahead and heat this up. It might be enough, it might not. Never done this bearing yet, so let's see how it goes. Thread your slide hammer on. And if we're lucky, it'll come out on the first try, but I doubt that's what's going to happen. So I'm in the shot here. Okay. All right, guys, so fun fact, I've been at this bearing for about an hour now with the slide hammer. The small size wasn't working too well. It kept slipping out, so I jammed the bigger size in. And now I'm using MAP gas to heat up the aluminum. The reason I'm using MAP gas, and you gotta be careful with this because you can, if you're not careful, you can start melting the housing, but this heats up the housing way faster. I don't know if you can see, but it's starting to come out a little bit. Ta-da. I guess I really wouldn't recommend pulling this bearing out, especially mine. It really wasn't, I don't know, it really wasn't marred up on the inside or anything. You could use just a new bearing race, I guess, and reuse this bearing shell. Because like I said, there wasn't even really damage to it, but I've never done this before and I wanted to see if I could get it out. When you put the new one in, there's no real orientation you have to worry about. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong guys, this opening here is just so you can grab it with a bearing puller, because it's in a blind hole, meaning you can't get to it from the back side. So I'm gonna go ahead and press a new one in. This is the part number for the rear countershaft bearing and shell. Just like that. Store this away for a moment. So it looks like this 27 works the same as the front shell does for pushing, for pressing it in. So there is a step on this one, meaning you can just press this in until it stops and you should be good. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this started. It's still very hot. I'm gonna hit it with a torch one more time. As you can see, I'm hitting the output shaft bearing, and that's why we haven't replaced it yet, because you're gonna wanna do this first if you're blasting everything with heat. So seems like it's expanded out a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and slam this guy in. The sound of it being seated. Double check. I'm gonna clean up a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and address the rear bearing. Next, we're gonna replace the output shaft bearing. You gotta take this side plug out with a spring on it, so you can move this arm to get to that bolt. But essentially, you're gonna remove these 5 10mm head bolts, and this plate's gonna pop off. So let's start by taking the plug out. It's a 19mm. It is under tension, so be careful. Now we can move this around to get to that bolt. This one does not need to come out. Keep track of the washers. See how I kind of pushed against this little lever here? It's spring loaded, but push it up and move it so you can move this arm to get to that bolt. And you're gonna go and take this out. You can kind of rest this lever by pushing down on the little roller, catching it against this raised area here, so it won't bounce into the output shaft bearing area. Flip it over. If you haven't removed the output shaft seal, you're gonna want to do that now. Seal puller. Make sure you're not resting it on the seal bore itself, just the seal. Rock it out. Here's that. Next, all you're gonna do is knock the bearing out. You can warm it up a little bit to get it out easier, so I'm gonna do that. Nope, that thing moved right in my way. I heard it, I should have checked. So out will come your bearing, and there is a shim underneath, which I'll go over in just a second. So get this guy back over there. When you're putting this back together, this shim's gonna go in here. We're gonna have to measure this to make sure it's within spec. So I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. All right guys, moving on. What we need to do next is make a quick measurement. And for this, you're gonna need a slide caliper or vernier caliper. So what you're gonna do is, say this is the new bearing. there's a protruding side right here. Don't measure on that. Just you're measuring the outer race. So you're going to take this measurement right here, write that down, and then you're going to measure the depth, the bearing depth, essentially. You're going to measure from this little land down here where the bearing gets pressed onto to one of these bolt lands. See how it's raised up above this? Measure from there to there using this end of the caliper. You're going to take this measurement right here, subtract it from this measurement, and that's going to be the size of your shim. So I've already done this. There is a list of different shims in the Bentley manual, and you can call your parts department, your BMW parts department, and they'll tell you what shims are available. There's a 0.3, 0.4, and 0.5 millimeter, and you can use them in conjunction with like 2 or more of them to get the depth that you need. I've already set mine up, so what you're going to do before you press this bearing in is put your shim down here, and then you're going to push the bearing in. This is the part number for the output shaft bearing, and here's the new one. Might look a little bit different than your old one. That's okay, they probably just went to a different manufacturer. You're going to put the exposed ball bearing side facing outwards, the side with the shield and the protrusion on the inner race is going to be towards the inside. And before you go and install this, make sure you got everything clean in here and heat this up. It says in the Bentley manual you're going to heat it up to 176 Fahrenheit. So essentially just get it really nice and hot with either a heat gun or some MAP gas. And then you're going to press it in. You can use a hydraulic press like I'm going to do with the other bearing, but it's a little bit easier just to press it in on the bench using the old bearing to press against it. When you press this new bearing in, because it has a protruding inner race, you're not going to want to put press on it with the old bearing until you take the middle out of it. This makes a great pressing tool. So this is the same bearing. I just went ahead and knocked the middle out of it, took the ball bearings out of it. When we go in and install this, you're going to set it in there, like I said, with the protruding side facing inside the transmission. And you're going to use this to push it in conjunction with a bearing in like seal pressing kit like this, 72 millimeter. Probably gonna grab a larger one, but yeah. Use this setup instead of just pushing it in with an old bearing, because you risk pushing on the inner race and that's gonna probably damage the ball bearings inside. So just keep that in mind. That's how I'm gonna do it. It's just safer that way. Okay, I'm going to get ready to press this in. I'm going to use the 81 millimeter driver, like that, bolt it in here. These are from Harbor Freight. They're really cheap. You don't have to use these, but it makes it easier. So I'm going to use that, like I said, in conjunction with this. Let's do one more check that you've got your shim in there and that it's clean. There's no debris in here, and go ahead and start heating this up. In fact, I'm going to take this shim out really quick. Heat in here. Should be good. Drop the shim in one more time. Bearing. Fell right in. I didn't have to press it in. So if you get it warm enough, hot enough I should say, should go right in. I'm still going to give it one more little tap just to make sure. Go ahead and let it cool down for a second. Okay, now the fun part is getting this back in.
So you've got to get it lined up with the holes, and you're going to have to lift up this little roller to get it to press on this lever. And you've also got to get it behind this little, I'm not really sure what it's called, but I'm sure I mentioned it in the last video. Grab some bolts, get one started. Don't cross thread them because you're going to be putting a lot of pressure on them while you're doing this. They should go in easily. Make sure they have the washers on them. You might have to pry against the little plunger in the back to get the whole assembly to move. I feel like it was easier last time, but I'm not sure what I did last time. I should go back and watch my video. Okay, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take this Allen bolt out right here. Okay, I'm gonna set this whole assembly aside, take the little roller out. That should help us get where we wanna be, because I don't have more than 2 arms here, so. Okay, so it's kind of difficult. Like I said, I don't remember what I did last time, but a little bit of prying and pushing this little plunger in, you should eventually be able to get 2 bolts in, and once you get 2 bolts in, it should stabilize and you'll be able to get the rest in. So I'm just gonna slowly tighten these down. This is the tricky one. Well, it's not right now because the spring's not in it. Okay, I'm not going to torque these to spec per se, but I am going to tighten them down pretty snug. Keeping in mind that the case is aluminum that these bolts are going into, so. Okay, from here you're just going to reassemble, put this thing back on, slide the little roller back on. Just cleaning some of that sealant off because we're going to have to reapply it. All right, you guys remember this, Curil K2. Running really low on this, so I don't even know if I can get it anymore. So this might be the last time I use it. I definitely don't have enough to do the case, so I'm gonna use RTV on that. So I'm gonna paint it on this surface right here. Let me get this. Okay, let's get this guy in here. I'm gonna put some sealant on the bolt thread, just because. Get it started. Pray it doesn't explode. There we go. All right. Did it correctly, you should end up with something like this. And it's time to put this contraption back in, which pushes pressure onto the whole assembly. Sneak a little sealer onto the threads there. Probably don't have to, but I've got it, so might as well. Ta-da! New bearing shell. New bearing for the output shaft. This is pretty much ready here to get the gear train back in. Make sure you don't have any gunk in the selector rod holes here. Okay, here's a bonus step if you guys want to do this. Take your new countershaft bearings, set your countershaft in, put your front countershaft bearing on, and take the front case. Make sure you have any sealer cleaned off of here. So I'm not going to show you how to do this exactly, because you're supposed to put a dial indicator gauge like on here if you have the clamp type, and focus the dial indicator gauge on this movement right here. Bolt the case together. You could probably use just, I don't know, half of the bolts, but bolt it together, and then you're going to check the end play here. So I already know mine is in spec. You're going to want a really low number, thinking between here we go, 0.13 to 0.23 millimeters, or that's the spec in inches. It's right out of the Bentley manual. And here they call it the lay shaft. I call it the counter shaft. To each his own. But if you're out of spec, you're going to have to order different shims to put in here. If you remember from earlier when I installed the bearing shell. But like I said, I already measured mine. And then I broke my dial indicator, so I can't show you how, but that's how you're going to do that. And at that point, if you're in spec, pull it back apart, and then we're going to do reassembly. Okay, this is my least favorite part of the whole ordeal. You're going to heat up the inner race only, 176 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty hot. And then we're going to put the rear case onto this assembly. So you've got to line up the output shaft, the counter shaft to its bearing, and these two shift rods into the respective holes, this one and this one. And it gets kind of messy, so let's see how it goes this time. Aye. Okay, it's almost in. The counter shaft is lined up into its bearing. You can feel. Yep. So you want to make sure that's lined up, otherwise this next step can pinch it and might destroy it. So make sure you got it lined up. You're supposed to use a BMW special tool to push this together, but I use the output shaft flange, drive shaft flange. Okay, I haven't pressed a new seal in the back yet, but what I'm doing is I'm using the output flange and the nut to basically as a puller to pull the case into or onto the bearing, or pull the shaft onto the bearing. But yeah, this way it's only exerting the pressure on the inner race and it's not messing up the bearing. So this is the way I do it. It works every time. So essentially, I didn't get that in the shot, but I tightened it down until it bottomed out. And then I just loosened it back up, and I'm going to take the output flange back off. So now if everything worked out right, I should be able to take this out of the vise. So I'm just making sure that bearing got seated in here correctly. Sounds good. So moving on. This is going to be kind of a harder shot to get, but you need to remove this little cap right here. And you can do so by going in through the middle shift rod hole. I'd probably recommend doing this before you put it back together, but I forget every time. Pop it out. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this, but if you look in there, you're going to see a hole that way and another hole that goes the other way. You're going to take 2 ball bearings, put some grease on them, and get them in those holes. Take some grease. It's probably a lot, but it's okay. The head's probably in the way, but get it in. Go to the left. And put one in the other side. Okay, now we're going to go back into neutral. It's like that, and like that. Okay, sometimes you gotta look in there, but as long as you don't have any gears engaged, you should be in neutral. Okay, next we're going to drive this shaft in. If you remember, there's a little pin that goes in there, so dab of grease and that'll hold it in. So you're going to go in like this with it, with the little cutouts facing up. Don't forget to go through the fork. Sometimes it's hard to get the little serrated, whatever you want to call it, part through the fork, so use a little force, just make sure you're supporting the back of it. Okay, I was wondering why this wasn't lining up correctly, and it's because I have this upside down. Got a little ahead of myself. All right, well, after a lot of swearing, I got this on right. I had to pull this shaft back off, but let's not talk about that. It's the first time I made that mistake. Okay, now you can put the roll pin back in and try and support it a little bit while I'm doing so. Okay, what you're going to do next is take the remaining 3 detent balls and drop them into their bores. Make sure I'm still in neutral. Drop them in there. Got a shorter spring, it goes towards the shift linkage tower here. So there's a shorter one, and then 2 long ones. And since I'm running out of Curil K2, I'm going to use some RTV. So I'm just using some leftover gray RTV from, sorry, I keep hitting the camera. Leftover from a Dodge that I was working on. Seems to be really good stuff. Okay, slap the bolts back in. Torque spec is 10 Newton meters. I'm just gonna go by feel. All right, next get this operating lever. Drive the pin in it in this orientation. Just start the pin a little bit so you can get the shaft through there. Okay, I'm gonna put the bearings back on the operating lever, shaft, the selector lever, whatever you want to call it. Just the main lever that shifts everything. You're gonna go in through the rear of the case, and this cutout section is gonna face that way. So this operating lever is going to slide in between this area. Sometimes there's a burr on the end of the shaft that makes it hard to get the operating lever in, but you can force it in just gently. Just make sure you don't knock any of the bearings off the back or anything. Okay, drive the roll pin in. Make sure you're supporting the shaft again. Next, we're going to install this guy. This mark goes over here. Put the pin in to secure it. All your shift forks should still shift if you want to go ahead and try them now. Next, we're going to install the reverse gear idler and shaft. Just going to go in right in that area. So before you install it, you're going to want to put some sealer on here. Okay, set the gear in, mesh it up with the reverse gear. Let's put a little bit more sealer right here. A little bit on the bolt. Next, we're going to put the lock plate on. Sits right in this little groove. This pin goes into that hole and the bolt goes into that hole. So this is an important step somehow, according to the Bentley manual. When you're tightening this up, you want to apply outward pressure. Not really sure why they ask you to do that, but just following instructions. It's 18 foot-pounds if you want to torque it. Before you get too carried away, don't forget to put this little end plug in here. Put some of this sealer on. Install it flush with a hammer and a punch. Just like that. All set. All right, now we can install some seals. Get it nice and flush with the housing. You should be all set with that one. Sorry, I forgot to show you the part number. That's the part number for the output shaft seal. Here is the shift shaft seal part number. Throw a little lube on the shaft so we don't cut the seal putting it on. Because trust me, you don't want to do this on the car if you have an all-wheel drive E30. Okay, 16mm deep well should do the trick. Maybe not. Let's try 17. Okay, yeah, just sink it flush with the housing here. Make sure you didn't tear it or anything putting it in, and it looks good to me. Okay guys, we're gonna do a couple things before we install the flange. Put some silicone grease on the seal surface here. Take your anaerobic sealer and coat the splines in here. Just try to get it down in the grooves of the splines. And go ahead and put it on. Go ahead and get it splined up. You can use your socket to get it started by tapping on it. Then you're going to put more sealer on where the nut's going to land here, so none of the transmission fluid leaks through the back here. Now we're going to go ahead and get the nut torqued down here in 2 steps. One is to seat it, and then the next step is like a little lower torque so it's not over torqued. First torque spec is 123 foot-pounds. You're gonna need something to hold the flange. I use this fan clutch tool. Here's the part number, it's from Napa. Okay, so now you're going to loosen it back up and tighten it back down. This time you're going to torque it to 87 foot-pounds. You're going to install a new lock ring. Okay, now I'm just flipping the case up. I'm getting the flange for the rear case all cleaned up. Take your countershaft bearing, some grease on it. This side goes up, this side goes towards the countershaft. Pop that on there, grab some sealer, put it on the reverse gear idler right here. That's going to seal it to the front half of the case. Now you're going to get this side cleaned up. I don't know if you guys can see this, but I'm putting a little grease on the shift shafts here. Okay, this time I'm not going to use the anaerobic sealer on here. The only reason I'm going to do that is because, or the only reason I'm not going to do that is because I'm currently running out. I don't have enough to paint that surface, so I'm just going to use RTV. It's totally fine. It'll seal up just as well. I guess the only difference is if you ever have to take this apart, again, it's harder to clean RTV off than it is anaerobic sealer. So no big downside there. Just going to use RTV this time. If you saw earlier, I'm using Mopar Threebond. It's just a gray RTV. It's good stuff. You can use whatever you like. You can use the stuff from Napa, the Ultra Gray, or Honda Bond, as long as it's a good RTV. Try not to get too much into the bolt holes or the dowel pin holes. The stuff starts drying fast. It's not that hot out today, but if you live in a warm climate like over 70, the stuff's going to start setting up quickly. So just try to get it all evenly coated, but don't take your time. Just putting another thin layer on the opposite side of the case. Just going to go around quick and get it cleaned up and make sure I don't have it on any parts of the transmission I don't want it on. I guess that's the only other downside to RTV is that it sticks to stuff and it hardens up and it'll get in there if you're not careful. Whereas anaerobic will, if it's not in between two sealing surfaces, it's not going to dry, so it'll wash out with the gear oil, and you can do a gear oil change after, I don't know, like 100 miles and get any that you left in there out of it. I should have did this beforehand, but take your fill bolt out. And take the drain bolt out as well because I have to clean it. Or you're going to use this to position, you're going to go through here to position the counter shaft. So you're going to be trying to line up this and the shift shafts to their respective holes in here. So if you're hung up on the counter shaft, all you have to do is go in through the fill bolt and kind of pry against it with a screwdriver until it goes in. See, sometimes it's not easy, and then all of a sudden it'll click and go into place. Okay guys, time to put the bolts back in. Put the long one in first so you know where it goes. Just to the right of the shift tower, you'll see the longer hole. let's go around and torque them to 18 foot-pounds. Now we're going to put the dowel pins back in. Grab your other bolt for the reverse idler gear. Put that guy in there. $18 foot-pounds. Back around to the other side. You put your lock pin back in here. Let's see which way it goes, up and down like this. Hopefully you saw that. Spring goes in here next. And the cap. Reverse gear switch. Snug this bad boy up, 19 millimeter. Torque spec is somewhere like 59 to 89 foot-pounds, so use your best discretion. Alright guys, got the transmission mounted on my shop press, and I didn't do this last time, but I thought it would be worth mentioning. If you're working on an all-wheel drive IX transmission, you're going to have this different rear housing. There's going to be two dowel pins, like one right there and one on the opposite side. I removed them this time, so this rear housing would sit flat against this. I think last time I shimmed it with something, but I also didn't have a slide hammer last time, so. Okay, now you've got to heat this area up that the bearing's going to go into. It's going to be hard to get on camera while I'm doing this, but at the same time, heat up the inner race. I'm going to put the old bearing on top to use as a pressing guide. So you can see I'm using the tool that I used to split the cases apart to press in the bearing. After that last video, I got to thinking about how to make a special tool that'll get this input shaft pulled through the inner race. And I kind of figured it out. It's a little rough, but it works. So I took an inner race from an old bearing. I cut it in two, kind of cleaned up the edges. I took an old seal lip retainer, spring, whatever you want to call it, put it around. So you kind of got this kind of action here. Plop that down on there, and since it's an old bearing race, it's going to match up perfectly to the inner race on there. From there,
I had this old GM tool kicking around. It's for like aligning some kind of seal or something. There's the part number. Doubt you guys are going to buy one of these to do this job, but if you come up with something similar, it'll work for you. And I got some all thread. It's 1/2 inch. I took one of my old input shaft bearing seal housing guys here, cut the tube off of it, and that'll match up with this inner race here. So next, you get this aligned with its holes right. Let's see. Here's the oil thing. So it's going to go in like this. And you're going to want some slightly longer bolts. And you're going to screw that down. Okay, so what this is doing is keeping tension on the inner race. So when we pull this out, it's not going to let the bearing slip out, get pulled out, or more importantly, damage it. All right, what I'm going to do next is just try to keep any debris out of the brand new bearing that I just put in. Like I said, this is pretty crude, but it works. So I went over to Ace Hardware and I grabbed this little tiny U-bolt. Sorry, I already forgot what size it is. But there's this little kind of cutout section here on the input shaft. And I'm thinking that maybe there's a special tool that fits in there from the factory. I can't find a picture of one, nor do I know what it looks like, but now that I know this works, I'll probably come up with a better solution, more refined tool in the future, but for now, this works pretty good. And I know this because I tried it on a spare transmission with old bearings and stuff like that, so I wanted to make sure it worked on that before I went and tried it on my good transmission with brand new bearings. So you're gonna get the U-bolt snugged up underneath this little cutout area. I think that's pretty tight. So what that's gonna do is it's gonna prevent this from coming off the input shaft. So this is gonna be pulling up. It's gonna pull the shaft right through the bearing until it stops, by means of my engine support bar. Slap some washers on here. Some nuts. Probably cut these bars down if you wanted to, so I don't have to sit here and thread these nuts all day. Okay, try to get these straight up and down as best as you can. The part that kind of sucks is I haven't really figured out how to get these nuts to stay still down here, so I've got a little 19mm crow's foot that I kind of hang on to the bottom one with as I turn this. And I'm going to go back and forth slowly, tightening these nuts. I don't know if you guys just heard that, but it popped. There's another one. So it's coming up. Keep going a little bit just to make sure. All right, I'm gonna see where we're at. All right, looks like it's all the way out. All right, guys.
There we go. Clipped right in. I'm gonna give it a little tap to make sure it's all the way in, but should be good. Oh yeah. That's my new method of pulling the input shaft through the inner race. Seems to work. I could probably revise the tool, kind of simplify it, but for now, this is what I'm gonna use, and I'm gonna keep brainstorming, see if I can come up with something better. If you guys have a different idea, let me know. I'm always open to suggestions. One more quick thing. I just reread the Bentley manual, and I just wanted to reiterate that they say you're supposed to stick a feeler gauge between the spacer and the circlip after you install it, and then pull up on the input shaft. And you're supposed to have 0 to 0.09 millimeters. So I got I have 0 clearance right now. So, all right, a couple more things. We're gonna replace the seal. There's the part number. New one goes in face first. Okay, looks like it's bottomed out in there, so move on to the next step. So here's another clearance measurement right here. You're going to take and measure the depth of the case from this point to the bearing, so the bearing depth, and then compare it to this depth right here. So you want, just like the other measurement, 0 to 0.9 millimeters of clearance. So what I do, instead of writing this down and subtracting it, I just put the old shim on here and checking the clearance like that. To me, that looks good. You can measure it out if you'd like. I'm not going to, because this is my transmission and it worked last time, except the bearings were just bad. So great. Go ahead and set that in there just like that. Put some grease on the shaft here so the seal doesn't get torn up. One last quick clean of brake cleaner. We'll go ahead and use some RTV on this. You can use that or anaerobic sealer, it's up to you. This is the sealing surface right here. Okay, if you're wondering which way this goes in, this little oil cutout hole matches up with here. Hey guys, torque spec is 89 inch-pounds. Well, there you have it. If everything went well, you've got a transmission that's all back together, that still rotates, that still shifts, and now you've got the best part still ahead of you, putting it in the car. I'm gonna end it here. I'm not gonna show you to put the release bearing and the pivot arm and all that stuff on there, because I did that in the last video and I think it's just a little redundant, but yeah, hopefully this helps you out, guys. I'm still trying to learn and figure out better ways how to rebuild these things. So questions, comments, concerns are all welcome. And yeah, like, share, subscribe, hit the bell, do the thing. And I'll be making more of these videos and a lot of other thing car related here pretty soon. So we'll see you on the next one.